I have told this story only once before to my own wife, on the night she asked me why I believed in love with such unfashionable conviction. I told her about Dunmore. I told her about the girl in the gray cloak. And when I finished, she wept not from sadness, but from the kind of recognition that lives in the chest and does not leave. I am Lord Ashcroft. I was, for 20 years, the closest friend of Caelan Voss, the Duke of Dunmore, the most feared, the most admired, and the most deliberately misunderstood man I have ever known. I watched him govern 3 counties with a hand of iron and a mind of iron, and I watched him, one winter's night on the northern moor, become undone by a woman in a borrowed dress who refused to weep in front of him. This is what I saw. Dunmore Castle stood at the edge of the northern moor as though it had grown there, black stone and tall towers, wreathed in fog for 9 months of every year. The locals called it the Grey Fortress, and they were not wrong. Caelan had inherited it at 19, along with his father's debts, his father's enemies, and his father's reputation for severity. He had paid the debts, outlasted the enemies, and earned the severity on his own terms. He was not cruel. He was exacting. There is a difference, though society rarely cares to make it. Those who had not met him imagined, from his reputation, a man of cold theater, a drawn-room tyrant who enjoyed the effect of his own displeasure. Those who had met him knew something more uncomfortable, that he meant exactly what he said, gave no false courtesies, and applied the same unsparing standard to himself that he applied to everything else. Men feared him because they could not flatter him. Women, who were sometimes offered to him by ambitious fathers, were usually told nothing about him beyond the fact of his title and his fortune, and arrived at Dunmore with one set of expectations, and left with a very different set of impressions. Not because he was warm exactly, but because he was honest. And honesty, in the world of arranged matches and polished surfaces, has the startling quality of cold water. I arrived at Dunmore on the 3rd of November, having ridden 2 days from my own estate in the south. Caelan had written me a brief letter, 4 sentences, which was practically a novel by his standards, saying only that business had brought him into contact with a matter I might find interesting, and that I should come north before the first snowfall if I wished to see it. He did not tell me what the matter was. He never did. Caelan Voss communicated in outcomes, not in previews. I found him in his library, standing at the window with a glass of brandy he had not touched, watching the moor turn purple in the failing light. He turned when I entered, gave me the brief nod that passed for a warm welcome from him, and said, "Good, you're here. There is an auction tomorrow." "What kind of auction?" He said the name, Voss. I knew the name. Most of the North knew the name by then. Lord Voss of Kelwick, no relation to Caelan's family despite the shared surname, a coincidence that had made the man bold enough to approach Caelan twice about loans. Caelan had declined both times. Lord Voss had then borrowed from 4 other sources, wagered the proceeds on a shipping venture, watched the shipping venture sink with remarkable efficiency, and emerged from the ruin owing money to men who did not wait for courts to settle such matters. "He's selling his holdings?" I asked. "He's selling his daughter," Caelan said. He said it the way he said everything, with perfect flatness, the way a surgeon names a wound, not to shock, but because the fact required no decoration. I sat down. The practice was not unheard of in the North, though it was not respectable, and it was certainly not legal in any clean sense of the word. What men like Voss called a marriage arrangement, or a settlement of obligations, was, in the plain language of the matter, the selling of a woman to cover a debt. A creditor would agree to forgive a portion of what was owed in exchange for a bride. The girl had no voice in it. The law looked away because the law, in those years, had a talent for looking away from things that inconvenienced powerful men. "Who is the creditor?" I asked. "3 of them," Caelan said, "Hartwick, Pelham, and a man named Brent who trades out of the harbor at Greyport." He set the brandy down. "They've agreed to divide the debt forgiveness between them. The girl goes to the highest bidder. The auction is tomorrow at the Kelwick Estate House, a private gathering. His jaw moved. I have been invited. Why would they invite you? Because Hartwick owes me a favor and thought the invitation would please me. He turned from the window. And because I am a duke, and dukes give these transactions an air of legitimacy they do not deserve. I studied him. Kalen was 40 years old. He had never married. Society had speculated endlessly about why. Some said he was too cold, some said he preferred his own company, some said there had been a woman once before his father's death, and that whatever had happened there had sealed him off from that particular feeling. I did not know the truth. He had never told me. "Are you going?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "To bid." He did not answer that. He crossed the room, refilled his glass, and said, "Get some rest. We ride at 8. I did not sleep well. I lay in the guest room of Dunmore Castle listening to the wind come off the moor, and thought about a girl I had not yet met, and about the particular silence that had lived in Kalen's eyes when he said the word daughter, and about the brandy he had poured and not touched. The Kelwick Estate House was 3 hours' ride to the east, a sprawling old property gone to seed at the edges, gutters warped with damp, gravel drive overgrown at the margins, the kind of genteel decay that happens when a family has been spending more than it earns for 2 generations. Inside, the signs of recent, desperate tidying were everywhere. Flowers cut from the garden and arranged too tightly in vases that were themselves rather old, candles placed on surfaces that were ordinarily bare. The effort of someone who wanted the occasion to look less like what it was. The drawing room where the auction was held smelled of pipe smoke, and too many men in too small a space. There were 8 of us, not counting Lord Voss and his solicitor. Hartwick I knew by reputation, a heavy man with a red face who made his money in coal and spent it on wine, and whose particular quality was that he believed money entitled him to every courtesy that birth traditionally bestowed, without the responsibilities birth carried with it. Pelham was leaner, quieter, the kind of man who watches, who takes the form of the most useful shape the room requires and never wastes a gesture. Brent was younger than I expected, dark-coated, with the manner of someone accustomed to valuing things quickly and without sentiment. The others were minor landholders from the county and one Scottish lord whose presence I could not explain, and whose expression throughout suggested he could not entirely explain it either. Lord Voss stood at the front of the room, beside the fireplace, trying to look like a man in control of the proceedings. He did not look like a man in control of anything. His hands shook when he poured his tea, and he kept glancing at Hartwick with the expression of a dog uncertain whether the hand above it will offer food or a blow. Whatever I had imagined of him from his letters and his reputation, he was diminished in person, not by age or illness, but by the particular shrinkage that comes over men who have spent years making small cowardices and arrived at last at a large one. Kalen and I sat at the back. He had dressed as he always dressed, perfectly, austerely, in a coat of deep charcoal wool with a high collar and no ornamentation. He had not spoken during the ride. I had learned over 20 years that Kalen's silences had textures. This one was the texture of a man making calculations. The girl was brought in at 11 o'clock. I want to describe her as I saw her that morning, because the way I saw her then is important. Not to romanticize, but because the contrast between what that room did to her and what she refused to let it take from her is the whole point of this story. She was perhaps 24, medium height, dark hair swept up in a plain style, dressed in a gown of serviceable gray wool, not fine, not ruined, just honest, the gown of a woman who had given up pretending the occasion called for something better. Her complexion was pale from the cold or from the sleepless night or from both. Her hands were clasped in front of her and perfectly still. That detail lodged in me like a splinter. In a room full of men deciding her future, her hands were perfectly still. Not performing stillness. Not the careful stiffness of a woman holding herself together by force. the stillness of someone who has already gone somewhere internal and decided that what happens in this room cannot follow her there. She was present in her body and absent in the precise way she chose to be absent, and the effect was, I reach for the right word, inviolable. The room did not have access to her. Her name, the solicitor announced, was Miss Alara Voss. She was the only child of Lord Voss. She was in good health. She was accomplished in the domestic arts, in correspondence, and in estate management, having assisted her father in the running of Kelwick for the past 3 years. She was unmarried. She was to be offered in settlement of £2,400 of Lord Voss's outstanding debt, to be divided among the 3 primary creditors at whatever proportion the winning bid dictated. She did not look at the solicitor while he said this. She looked at the window. It was a gray morning, cloud flat, the bare branches of the kitchen garden visible through the glass. Whatever she saw there, or chose to see, chose to substitute for what was actually occurring in the room behind her. She held it. She did not flinch at the solicitor's inventory of her. She did not look at her father. She did not look at the men arranging themselves to bid on her future. She looked at the window, and her hands were still. The bidding was brisk in the way that bidding is brisk when none of the participants respect what they are purchasing. Hartwick opened at the debt face value, $2,400. Pelham raised it to $2,008. Brent, who had been watching the girl the way I would have watched a parcel of suspicious provenance, raised again to $3,000. Hartwick countered at $3,002. The room had the quality of men transacting at a market, engaged, brisk, indifferent to the thing being transacted. Then Kalin said, quietly and without rising from his chair, £5,000. The room went entirely still. £5,000 was more than twice the debt. It was, by the arithmetic of the thing, absurd. It was also the kind of bid that ended a conversation, the kind of number that reminded every man in the room who, precisely, the Duke of Dunmore was. In a county where a good estate might turn a profit of £400 or £500 in a year, £5,000 in a single utterance, flat and without emphasis, was as much a statement of intent as it was a sum. Hartwick did not counterbid. He looked at Kalin and then looked at his wine. Pelham studied the carpet. Brent looked at his hands for a long moment and then looked away. Lord Voss made a sound, something between relief and the beginning of tears, and the solicitor said, somewhat faintly, that the bid was accepted. And then, for the first time since she had entered the room, Alara Voss looked away from the window. She looked directly at Kalin. He held her gaze. He did not look away, and he did not look pleased with himself, and he did not look predatory. He looked at her the way he looked at things that required his full attention, with complete seriousness and without the smallest condescension, as though she were a person of consequence, which was the one thing that room had conspired to deny. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, then she returned her eyes to the window. Kalin stood, buttoned his coat, and said to the solicitor, "Have the papers sent to Dunmore. Miss Voss will travel with me." He did not look at Lord Voss at all. She did not speak during the first half of the carriage ride. Neither did Kalin. I sat across from them both and watched the northern landscape crawl past the windows, brown heather, black rock, the occasional white flash of a stream, and I had the peculiar sensation of witnessing something that had already been set in motion long before any of us had arrived in that drawing-room, as though the auction had been only the formal acknowledgment of a direction things were already moving. The silence was not uncomfortable. That surprised me. I had expected, if she said nothing, a taut, armored silence, the silence of a woman in a carriage with 2 strangers who have just bought her future. But it was not that. It was more the silence of a person still making assessments, still reading the room, which, in this case, was a moving carriage on the North Road. She looked at the landscape. She looked once at my shoulder. I had a habit then of carrying it incorrectly after an old hunting injury, and the look she gave it was involuntarily diagnostic, the look of someone accustomed to noticing what is wrong with things. Then she looked away. Halfway to Dunmore, with the moor spreading wide and gray on every side, she said, without turning from the window, "I should like to know what you intend." Her voice was level, not hostile, not afraid. Level the way a woman's voice is level when she has decided that whatever comes next, she will face it on her feet. Kaylin said, "I intend to give you shelter and every reasonable comfort my household can provide. Beyond that, the decision is yours to make when you are ready to make it." She turned then. She looked at him directly, and I saw something move behind her eyes, not gratitude precisely, but attention of the sharpest kind. The kind of attention a person pays to a thing they cannot yet explain. "You paid £5,000, she said. "That is not an act of charity." "No," Kaylin said, "it is not." "Then what is it?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind picked up and the carriage swayed. He said, "It is a beginning. What it becomes depends on what you want it to become." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, a flock of birds crossed the gray sky in a long, unraveling line. Then she said, "I want to understand the terms." "There are none," he said, "not yet. Rest first." She considered this. I watched her consider it, the small, careful assessment behind her eyes, the checking of the statement against whatever she knew of men who said things like "there are no terms." And then she turned back to the window. But I noticed, and I notice it still, all these years later, that her hands, which had been so perfectly still in that drawing room, were now very slightly different. Not trembling, not clasped together, simply resting, open in her lap. As though something had loosened, just a fraction at the center of things. Dunmore received her without ceremony, which was the greatest courtesy it could have offered. Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, a woman in her 60s who had run the household since Kaylin was a boy, and who possessed the particular authority of people who have made themselves indispensable through sheer competence, showed her to the east wing without commentary or curiosity. The rooms there were the warm ones, the ones with the long windows facing south and the fireplaces that drew cleanly and the beds with good mattresses. The rooms Kaylin kept ready without any particular reason. The rooms that now, for the first time, had a person who belonged in them. Kaylin told his household only that Miss Voss was a guest and was to be treated as such, and that anyone who asked about the circumstances of her arrival would answer to him personally. He did not need to say it twice. Mrs. Holt had the expression of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this eventuality for approximately a decade, and who had no intention of allowing it to be disrupted by idle talk. I watched Alara in those first 3 days. She explored the estate with the careful, observational quality of someone taking inventory, not from avarice but from habit, the habit of a woman who had managed a household and knew that safety lived in detail. She walked the grounds in the morning, starting always at the south gardens and moving outward with a systematic patience that suggested she was mapping the place in her mind, fixing it so that it could not surprise her. She visited the library on the second morning and emerged 2 hours later with 3 volumes under her arm, an estate management text, a natural history of the northern counties, and something smaller in a blue binding that I could not identify from across the hall. She sat in the west parlor in the afternoons and wrote letters. To whom, I did not ask. Whatever correspondence she had left unfinished in the chaos of her father's collapse, she was addressing it now with the same methodical calm she brought to everything. Whatever grief or anger or confusion lived beneath that calm, she kept it carefully below the surface and dealt in facts. Kaylin watched her too. Not with the heat of infatuation, that was not his way, and she would have seen through it in an instant, but with the steady attention of a man who has found something he did not know he was looking for, and is now very careful not to disturb it. He arranged his own days slightly differently in those first weeks. He rode later in the mornings, after she had come in from her walk, and the paths were clear. He took his correspondence in the library rather than the study, which meant he was more likely to be visible when she passed through. He did not engineer encounters. He simply arranged to be nearby and let the rest take its natural course. They spoke at dinner, which was where it began, as it always does, properly. Conversation forced close by the length of a table and the absence of other noise. On the fourth evening she said something cutting about the estate's drainage on the eastern edge, which she had walked that morning. She said it between courses, without preamble, as though she had been thinking about it all day and had simply arrived at the moment where it required stating. The drainage on the eastern boundary was redirecting water into the north field, she said. She had seen the result in the grass. A low, dark streak of waterlogged ground running north to south that would kill whatever was planted there by spring and undermine the boundary wall within 3 years if it went uncorrected. She was right about all of it. I had thought the same thing 3 years earlier, and Kalen had not listened. He listened to her. He set down his wine glass and asked a question. What route did she think the drainage should take instead, given the slope of the ground east of the mill? She answered it with the precision of someone who had been thinking about exactly this question and had arrived at an answer she was willing to defend. He asked a second question. She answered that too. "You know estate management," he said. "I told you at the auction," she said, "through your solicitor at least." "That is not the same as seeing it for yourself." "No," she agreed, "it is not." A small pause. "I learned because there was no one else. I was 21. The estate manager left without notice in February. My father was in London." She said it without bitterness, but precisely, not softening the facts for his comfort. "By March, I had taught myself enough to get us to planting season. By June, I had filed 3 disputed boundary assessments with the county office and won 2 of them." The table was very quiet. Kalen looked at her. Not with pity. She would have found pity intolerable, and he knew the difference, instinctively, between pity and recognition. He looked at her with recognition, as though something he had suspected about the shape of her had just been confirmed. "The third," he said. "The third I lost on a technicality. The boundary commissioner was Hartwick's cousin." A brief, dry beat. I was not entirely surprised. He asked her then. I saw him decide to ask, saw the small reset in his expression that meant he was about to say something he did not say easily, whether she would be willing to walk the eastern drainage with him the following morning. Not as an obligation, he said. As a favor to him, if she had the inclination. She said yes. Then she returned to her dinner as though she had answered a question about the weather, but the small lift at the corner of her mouth told a different story entirely. I excused myself early that night. Some things are better witnessed from a respectful distance. They walked the estate together every morning after that, for the first week, and then the second, and then it became simply what they did. Kalen told me, in the fragmented, chronological way, he told me things he had been turning over for days. The drainage, yes, and the tenant cottages on the north boundary where 3 families were living with a collapsed gable, and no one had reported it because they feared the rent consequences. And the roof of the old mill that she had noticed on her second day, because the angle of the light on the moss told her the structure beneath was wet, and she had stood for a long time looking at it before he thought to ask what she was looking at, and she had explained in terms of runoff and timber that made him call the millwright before noon. She had noticed the mill roof as it emerged, because she had spent 6 months learning to read a surveyor's diagram when her father's estate manager quit without notice and left her to manage the accounts alone. She was 21 years old and her father was in London losing money, and she had done it. Without help, without credit, without anyone knowing. She never told anyone, I asked. Who was there to tell? Kalen said. He said it simply, but I heard the edge beneath it, the fury on her behalf that he would not permit himself to name, because fury was not useful and he was, always, a man who preferred the useful. He filed it instead in the place where he filed things that required a reckoning, and returned to the problem in front of him, which was the mill roof and the east drainage and the tenant gable. none of which were going to fix themselves while he sat in the library being indignant. She did not know he was angry on her behalf. I'm not certain she would have welcomed it at that stage. What she welcomed, I think, what she had very seldom had, and could not quite account for when it was offered, was being taken seriously. Every observation noted, every argument engaged, every estimate given the same weight it would have been given had it come from a man of 30 with a land agent's certificate. He was falling in love with her. I could see it the way you see whether coming across the moor not one thing, but a gathering of small things, each unremarkable alone, that together become unmistakable. The way he stood when she entered a room, a degree more alert. The way he deferred to her estimates on the estate work without making a ceremony of the deference. The way, at dinner, he angled his entire conversation toward whatever she had found interesting that day. The way he began, very quietly, to modify certain household routines to accommodate her habits. She preferred to take her breakfast early, and he was not naturally an early riser, but by the second week he was reliably at the table before 8. She did not ask this of him. She probably did not even notice it. He did it because it was what he wanted to do. Because mornings were better, apparently, than they had previously been. He did not know he was doing half of it. Or if he knew, he had decided not to examine it too closely, which was unlike him in most contexts but entirely understandable in this one. Elara was harder to read. She was warm and she was clever, and she was not unhappy at Dunmore, that much was visible. She had begun to move through the house with the ease of someone who belongs somewhere and has recently understood that they belong, that quiet physical loosening that comes with familiarity. She borrowed from the library freely. She made small suggestions to Mrs. Holt about the kitchen stores that Mrs. Holt accepted with the grace of a woman who agrees, but required someone else to say it first. She sat with me, occasionally, in the evenings when Kaelan had a state correspondence that ran late, and talked with the comfortable directness of someone who has given up performing sociability in favor of simply being it. But she was careful. She was careful the way a woman is careful when she has learned that circumstances change without warning, that the rug of comfort can be lifted at any moment by the men who hold the corners. She liked Kaelan. She trusted him further than she would have trusted most men she had known 3 weeks, but she was not yet sure she could afford the next distance, the one between liking and belonging, and she was not going to cross it until she had assessed the ground. I respected her for it, even as I watched Kaelan navigate it with the careful patience of a man who understood exactly why it existed and would not hurry her past it. The letter from Hartwick arrived on the 12th day. I was in the library when Kaelan read it. He read it twice, which was rare. He was a fast reader, and he did not usually require repetition. Then he set it on the desk with a deliberateness that I had learned to recognize as his version of contained anger. "Hartwick is contesting the settlement," he said. "On what grounds?" "He claims the auction was improperly conducted, that his bid was not given adequate consideration before mine was accepted." Kaelan's voice was even. "He is arguing, in essence, that the settlement arrangement should be reviewed by the county magistrate, and that a fresh determination should be made about the disposition of the—" He stopped. His jaw was set. He uses the phrase, "the asset in question." I absorbed this. Can he make that argument legally? He can try. Kaelan stood. What he can also do, and what I suspect is his actual intention, is create enough noise about the matter that it draws the attention of the county courts, which would require Elara to appear before those courts and explain, in public, the circumstances of her father's debt sale, which would expose her to exactly the kind of scrutiny that would make it very difficult for her to establish any kind of life afterward. Her name attached to that history publicly in a formal proceeding. The cruelty of it was elegant in its way. Hartwick did not want the girl. He had never particularly wanted the girl. She was a means of recovering a debt, and the debt was now recovered regardless of who had paid it. What Hartwick wanted was to punish Kaelan for outbidding him, and the girl was the instrument available. The county court proceeding would cost Kaylen nothing in material terms. Its cost would be borne entirely by Alara. "Does she know?" I asked. "Not yet." Kaylen moved to the window. The moor was gray and vast under a low sky, and somewhere out there the first winter storm was building over the northern ridge. "I need to think." "About what? You'll fight Hartwick's claim." "Of course I'll fight it." "I'm thinking about Alara." He turned. "She has been living here for 12 days. She has been gracious and composed, and she has asked me nothing except reasonable questions about the estate. She has not made any demands about her future, and she has made very clear by not making them that she intends to arrive at that subject on her own terms in her own time." His jaw was set. "If I go to her now and tell her that the settlement is being challenged, I am taking that from her. I am turning her back into the subject of other men's decisions before she has had a chance to feel anything else." I looked at him. He was right. And the fact that he understood that, with the precision and the care he brought to understanding it, told me something I had suspected for 12 days and was now certain of. "Kaylen," I said, "you're in love with her." He was quiet for a long time. The wind pressed at the library windows. The fire crackled once and settled. Then he said, "I have been in love with her since she looked at the window and refused to weep." A pause. "Which does not make the problem of Hartwick any simpler." "Does it not?" "No, because I cannot protect her by declaration alone. If I go to her and say what I feel and then immediately tell her about Hartwick's challenge, she has no way of knowing whether I am telling her the truth about my feelings or whether I am managing her, preparing her to agree to something that consolidates my position." He turned back to the window. "She has no reason to trust me yet. She has reason to think well of me. That is different." He was right about that too. That was always the thing about Kaylen. He was right about the thing that hurt him most to be right about. "Then what are you going to do?" "Tell her tonight," he said, "about Hartwick, plainly and without framing, and then ask her what she wants to do about it and help her do whatever that is." "And about the rest of it?" He said nothing. He told her that evening after dinner in the library. I was not present for the telling, that was not mine to witness, but I sat in the adjoining room and heard the murmur of their voices through the closed door for nearly an hour. Once I heard her voice rise, not in fear or tears, but in a sharp, clear syllable of anger that was almost immediately contained, the way a flame is drawn back by the hand that shields it. Then the lower register of Kaylen's voice, very quiet. Then silence. Then her voice again, steadier. "When Alara came out she was alone, and she walked past me without speaking, and her eyes were very bright, not with tears. With the brightness of someone who has just received news that confirms a thing they already suspected, and whose anger at having suspected correctly is stronger than their surprise. She did not weep. I want to be clear about that. She had not wept in the drawing room at Kelwick, and she did not weep that night. She was angry in the clean, contained way she was angry. I could see it in the set of her shoulders and the pace of her walk, the particular forward movement of a woman who has decided to do something and is already composing it in her mind. She went to her rooms. And at 10:30, when I returned to the library, I found Kaylen standing exactly where I had left him, holding Hartwick's letter and looking at nothing. "She wants to go to Hartwick herself," he said. I blinked. "I beg your pardon." She said, and I am quoting because she was very precise about it, that she has spent her entire life watching other people make decisions about her without her present, and she is not willing to watch Hartwick do it while she sits at Dunmore waiting. She wants to go to his estate. She wants to look him in the eye and inform him, formally and in front of witnesses, that the settlement was lawful, that she consents to its terms, and that she will contest any legal challenge he brings with the full force of a signed affidavit. He set the letter down. She has already thought of the arguments. She outlined 3 of them. I stared at him. Can she do that? She can do exactly that. The settlement was lawful. Her consent is legally relevant. It would significantly weaken Hartwick's claim to argue improper process when the subject of the settlement is willing to state on record that she found nothing improper about it. Kaelin's expression was the closest thing I had seen him produce to something you might call admiration, stripped of all sentimentality. She is correct on all three legal points. I asked my solicitor about two of them 3 years ago in a different matter, and the answer was the same. And you said? I said she was entirely correct, and that I would take her myself. The storm came in overnight, not the winter blizzard I had felt building for days, but a sharp autumn gale that stripped the last leaves from the trees in the Dunmore grounds and turned the moor roads to rivers of mud. By morning, the eastern track to Hartwick's estate was passable by horseback but not by carriage. Kaelin informed Alara over breakfast. She looked at the window, assessed the situation with the brief, practical attention she gave to most problems, and said she would ride. There were very few women of Alara's station who could ride in a northern gale across open moor without a complaint, and she was one of them. I watched her mount in the courtyard. She moved with the quiet competence of someone who had learned to ride out of necessity rather than leisure, someone who had covered difficult ground alone and without ceremony. And I thought, not for the first time, that her father's neglect had made her something she could not have become any other way. It was not a thought I could say aloud. It was one of those true things that cannot be spoken without diminishing the person they are said about. We rode for an hour into the teeth of the wind. The moor in a gale is a different creature from the moor at evening. It has a voice, a low, persistent roar that lives in the grass and the rock and the shallow water of the drainage channels, and it presses on you like a hand. Alara rode slightly ahead of us both, with the upright posture of someone determined to set the pace and not be managed into slowing it. Kaelin rode at her left, close enough to intercept if her horse shied, and I watched him watching the horizon and the road and her in equal measure. The instinctive watchfulness of a man who has identified what matters and is arranged accordingly. We were 2 miles from Hartwick's estate when the horse went down. Not Alara's horse, mine. A patch of ground that looked firm lifted under his right foreleg and went soft, the way more ground does when the water table rises in a storm. I had half a second before he stumbled, a half second in which I understood what was about to happen and could do nothing about it. I went over his neck and landed in the mud in a way that took the air out of me completely and sent a bright, hard shock up through my left shoulder that told me, in the clear, fluent language of pain, that something was wrong. I lay still for a moment, face to the sky. The world was gray cloud and wet grass, and the sound of hooves pulling back and stopping and voices. Then 2 faces above me, Kaelin's, alert and controlled, the immediate assessment of a man who has seen men hurt before and does not panic, and Alara's. And the expression on her face was not one I had seen before because no one had ever needed it in my presence. It was the expression of someone who is frightened and will not be stopped by being frightened. Her eyes moved over me quickly. Her hands reached for my shoulder before either of us spoke. "Don't move it," she said. "The joint, let me look." I said with some feeling that she was welcome to look at whatever she liked provided it did not require me to sit up. She made a sound that, under other circumstances, might have been a laugh. Her hands were careful and deliberate, and her assessment was quick and competent. She pressed here and not there, asked me to indicate the location of the pain with a specificity that suggested she knew what she was looking for before she found it. She said the shoulder was dislocated, not broken, and that it needed to go back in before I rode another foot, and that she had done this twice before, for tenants at Kelwick, and that she needed Kaelin to hold my arm at a particular angle while she managed the rest. Kaelin crouched in the mud without comment. He looked at her. She met his gaze and told him precisely what she needed him to do. He did it. I will not describe the next 2 minutes in detail because they were not the finest of my life, but when it was over the shoulder was back where it belonged, and the pain had diminished from searing to the manageable ache of something recently traumatized, and I was sitting up in the mud with the considerable dignity of a man who has just been put back together by a woman 12 years his junior, and Kaylin was watching her with an expression he had not bothered to arrange. She crouched in the mud in her riding coat in the wind without the smallest ceremony and looked at me with an expression that was simply practical. "Can you ride?" "Yes," I said, carefully. "Then we continue." She stood. She checked that my horse was undamaged. She remounted with the same efficiency she had dismounted. She did not look at Kaylin to see whether he agreed with the decision to continue. She looked at the road ahead and started for it. I looked at Kaylin. He was still watching her. His expression was so unguarded in that moment, so entirely without the careful flatness he wore like armor in every room, every drawing room, every dining room of every house in the north, that I had to look away. Not from embarrassment, from something closer to reverence. Some things are not meant to be witnessed too directly. Hartwick's estate was everything Dunmore was not. All bright surfaces and recent money, built wide rather than deep, the kind of house that announces its cost at every window. The sort of house that makes you understand on sight that what its owner values most is being seen to have value. A footman admitted us to a formal salon where Hartwick arrived 12 minutes later, by which point I had dripped a considerable quantity of more mud onto his Turkish carpet, and was not sorry about it. He arrived with the studied composure of a man who has rehearsed what he means to say and finds the room is not arranged as he expected. He had expected Kaylin. He had perhaps expected a legal representative. He had expected, at most, some version of negotiation conducted between men on behalf of the woman in question, with the woman safely elsewhere. He had not expected Alara. She stood at the room's center, muddy from the ride, coat still buttoned, nothing in her hands, and she let Hartwick arrange himself, let him take his chair and reach for the composure of a man who believes the high ground is his by virtue of having arrived in a dry room. And then she said, with a clarity that carried to every corner of the salon, "Mr. Hartwick, I am here to tell you before witnesses that the settlement of the 12th of November was conducted lawfully and with my knowledge and consent, and that any challenge you bring against its terms will be contested by me personally, in writing, before whatever authority you choose to name. I will sign a statement to that effect in your presence today, if you have a solicitor available." Hartwick looked at Kaylin. Kaylin stood slightly behind her and to her left, arms at his sides. He said nothing. His expression said with complete clarity that this was her room and her moment, and that he was here because she had asked him to be and for no other reason, and that he was entirely at ease with the arrangement. Hartwick looked back at Alara. He was not a stupid man. Stupid men do not make the kind of money he had made, and they do not identify the instruments of retaliation with the speed he had shown. But he was a man accustomed to a world in which women in Alara's position did not appear in his salon with mud on their boots and 3 legal arguments and the particular expression she was wearing. He recalculated. I watched him recalculate, watched the speed at which he assessed the situation, and understood that the angle he had chosen was no longer available to him. "I had some concerns," he said, in the voice of a man retreating with whatever dignity he has left to carry, "about the procedural propriety of the matter." "I have just addressed your concerns," Alara said. "Do you require a written statement, or does your concern resolve itself with my attendance?" A long pause. The fire popped. Outside, the gale pressed at the windows. "That will not be necessary," he said. "Then we understand each other," she said. She turned, and as she turned, she looked briefly at Kaylin. Just a glance, the quick private exchange of 2 people who have just done something together that required them both, and something passed between them in that glance that I cannot name with any precision. But if I had to approximate it, I would say it was the look of 2 people who have just watched each other be exactly who they are, in conditions that did not allow for anything false, and have found what they saw to be more than sufficient. We rode back to Dunmore in a different configuration. Ilara and Kaylin rode together, close enough to speak privately, and I rode a courteous distance behind, and the gale had dropped and the moor was very quiet on every side. I could not hear what they said. I did not need to. I know, because Kaylin told me the next morning over coffee he had drunk too much of and which sat untouched in his cup, that he had told her on that ride home what he felt. He did not dress it in poetry, that was not Kaylin's way. He said he had ridden out there that morning knowing what he felt and not knowing whether to say it, and that watching her in Hartwick's salon, standing in a borrowed riding coat with mud on her boots and legal arguments assembled in her mind, refusing to be managed or diminished, had resolved the question for him. He told her that he had no interest in a life that did not have her in it. He said that he was aware she had arrived at his house under conditions that made any declaration from him a thing she might feel she could not refuse, and that he was not asking her for an answer. He was telling her the truth, he said, because she deserved the truth, and because he would rather tell her and be refused than not tell her and let her wonder. She had listened to all of it. The moor wide around them, the horses walking, the last of the storm moving east. And then she said, "I know you are not asking, but I would like to answer anyway." He told me her answer. I will not repeat it here because it belongs to them, but I will say that it was precise and clear and warm, and that it ended with her asking him one question: whether the drainage on the eastern boundary could wait until spring, because she had ideas for it that would require the ground to be dry, and that he had laughed. Not the small, controlled sound he sometimes produced at his own dry observations in company. A real laugh, the kind that surprises the person making it, out in the open air with the moor on every side, and the sky beginning to clear, and no one watching but God and the birds. He had laughed, and she had smiled, and they had ridden home together in the failing light. The spring planting was already done by the time Hartwick's formal withdrawal of his complaint arrived, in a letter tersely worded and without explanation. Kaylin read it at breakfast, passed it to Ilara, and returned to his eggs. She read it, set it aside, and reached for the estate ledger she had taken to bringing to the breakfast table by that point, because there was always something that needed discussing before the morning ride, and no hour was better for it than the first. He had not yet asked her formally. That seemed strange, perhaps, given all that had come before, but I understood it. Kaylin was not a man who moved without certainty, and the certainty he was waiting for was not his own. He was waiting for her. He was waiting for her to arrive at her own terms in her own time. The same patience he had shown since the carriage on the North Road when he said there are none, not yet. She arrived at them on a Saturday in March. I know the day because I was there, positioned at a considerate distance with a book I was not reading. They were in the kitchen garden. She had been arguing, on and off for a fortnight, that the south wall was better suited to peaches than to the espaliered pears it currently grew, and he had been listening to the argument with the expression he wore when he disagreed, and was in the process of being persuaded against his will. She had been pointing at the wall. He had been pointing at the ledger entry for the pears. And then she had stopped and she had looked at him, and she had said, "I have this from both of them separately and both accounts agree, Kaylin. I should like to stay." He had looked at her. "Not as a guest," she said. "Not as a settlement. I should like to stay because I am at home here and because you are the only person who has ever asked me what I want before making a decision on my behalf, and I find that I cannot think of any future I would prefer to this one." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have the ring." She blinked. "I beg your pardon." "I have the ring. I have had it for 2 months. He reached into his coat pocket. "I bought it the week after the ride to Hartwick's. I was waiting for you to be sure." She stared at him. "I was not certain," he said, with the kind of precision that made her laugh, "whether I should mention the ring before or after you spoke. I have revised my thinking on this several times." She was laughing when she said, "After was correct." He slid the ring onto her finger in the kitchen garden, with a wall of espoused pairs behind them and the March light and her laughing still, and his expression one that I had never in 20 years seen on his face, open, illuminated by a warmth that had always been present in him, and had never, before her, had anywhere to go. Like a room with a window newly uncovered. They were married in May, in the small chapel on the Dunmore grounds, which was older than the castle and smelled of cold stone and centuries of quiet faith. There was no grand society occasion. Kaylin wanted none, and Alara had suggested, with the mild practicality she brought to every suggestion, that anyone who wished to attend should be asked to arrive on horseback, which would eliminate the purely ceremonial element of the invitation list with admirable efficiency. Lord Voss was not present. He had sent a letter that Kaylin read once and filed without comment. Hartwick was not present. Pelham was not present. The men of that drawing-room in November were not present, and they were not missed. The people who were present were the people of the Dunmore estate, the household, the tenants of the north boundary, the miller whose roof had been repaired before winter, Mrs. Holt in her best gray gown standing very straight, and a small group of friends whom Kaylin had not so much invited as informed, which was how he gave invitations and had always been. I stood beside him at the front of the chapel. He was still, as he was always still, but the quality of the stillness was different from every other kind I had witnessed in him. It was not the stillness of control, or of calculation, or of a man managing the impression he creates. It was the stillness of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be and has, for the first time, nowhere else he would rather go. She walked in on the arm of the Dunmore estate steward, who was 90 years old and had known Kaylin since he was a boy, and who wept with the uncomplicated liberty of the very old, quite openly, making no attempt to conceal it. She was wearing white silk, not elaborate, not theatrical, a gown of quiet elegance, beautifully made but without ornament, the way she always chose things, as though what she put on was simply an extension of who she was rather than a performance of it. She came to the front of the chapel. She looked at Kaylin, he looked at her. I have witnessed a great many solemn occasions. I have learned to distinguish the ones that are merely ceremonial from the ones that are true. This was true. The look that passed between them was the look of two people who have already made every real decision and are now simply making it visible to the room, a formality that honors the substance rather than replacing it. The vicar spoke. They answered. When the moment came, Kaylin took her hand with the same care with which he did everything that mattered to him, complete attention, no rush, the acknowledgement that this particular moment would only happen once and deserve to be fully occupied. He said her name in the chapel when the vicar asked. Just her name, Alara. He said it the way you say a word you have been carrying for a long time, with the quiet weight of something you are finally allowed to set down. The word and the pause after it before the vows held the whole history, the gray wool gown and the window and the hands perfectly still, and the North Road carriage and the brandy untouched, and £5,000 said quietly to a room full of men, and the moor, and the mud, and the salon at Hartwick's with the clock on the mantel, and the fire crackling and Alara standing in the center of it with 3 legal arguments and nowhere in the world she would rather be. He said her name, and it was sufficient. Afterward, in the sunshine of the Dunmore grounds, the spring had come warm that year, as though it had something to make up for. I stood with a glass of very good wine and watched them walk among their people, her hand on his arm, his head bent slightly toward hers. The tenants and their families in a loose circle, the estate staff in their good clothes, Mrs. Holt accepting compliments with the expression of a woman who had arranged all of this internally years ago, and was simply watching the external world catch up. I thought about all the small and large decisions that had to align to produce this particular afternoon. The debt, and the auction, and the gale off the moor, and a horse that went down in the wrong patch of ground, and a woman who knew how to put a shoulder back into its socket, and had looked at a window in a drawing-room and refused to weep. There is a kind of love, I have come to believe, that does not begin with a feeling. It begins with an act of recognition, one person looking at another and understanding, not through warmth or desire, but through something closer to justice, that this person has been seen wrong by the world, and that the wrong should stop. And if the person who recognizes the wrong is patient and clear, and does not confuse protection with possession, the recognition sometimes becomes devotion. And the devotion sometimes becomes the thing you cannot imagine your life without. Kalen told me, some years later, we were both considerably older and somewhat less foolish, and his eldest daughter had just announced her intention to study mathematics, which Alara was enthusiastically encouraging, and he was pretending to find alarming, that he had no regrets about the £5,000. I was not charitable, he said, which was how he always framed it when he did not want to be sentimental about something. No, I agreed, you were not. I simply saw the transaction clearly. He was quiet a moment, then, she was worth considerably more. He said it without irony and without drama, the way he said everything true. I looked out at the Dunmore grounds, the drainage on the eastern boundary long since corrected, the south wall now carrying the most remarkable peaches I had ever tasted in my life, the east wing with its long south-facing windows lit up in the afternoon, and I thought, yes, she was. And you were the only man in that room, or in any room, who knew it. He is not a man given to speeches or declarations. His devotion was expressed in 20 years of the specific, daily, quiet business of adoration. In the boundary wall he rebuilt because she said it was dangerous for the tenant's children. In the mathematics books he ordered from London the week his daughter expressed an interest, in the way he still, after all the years I have known them, turned when she entered a room, not with the theatrical attention of a man performing attentiveness for an audience, with the attention of a man for whom the room has simply always been more interesting when she is in it. She was worth every pound, and every year and every morning walk he gave her until she was sure enough to say so. And he was worth the mud on her boots and the cold ride, and the careful 12 days, and every boundary she drew until she was ready to cross the last one. That is the whole of it. That is what I told my wife on the night she asked me why I believed in love with such unfashionable conviction, and when I finished she wept, and then she laughed, and then she said, "You should have led with the shoulder." Perhaps she was right. But I have always thought the window was the better beginning. A woman in a gray gown, in a room full of men deciding her future, looking at the window and refusing to weep. That was where it started, and everything else followed.